Greetings everyone, and welcome to part 11 of my series, Is God Real? In part 11, we are going to go back to the Revelation 12, 3-6 sign and show the sign of the fiery dragon. Back in part 2, we went over everything in white. Let's do a recap of what that part of the sign was. And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold a great red dragon. And the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. And she brought forth a man-child, who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up unto God and to his throne. Here we are at the timeline. I just remade this whole section for this video. Before we start, I want to remind you, everything in gold is scripture or scripture related. Everything in red is information. Everything in white is part of the sign. Here you see the fiery dragon. That's the sun. It's standing right in front of the woman. That's Virgo, and she's ready to be delivered. Jupiter the king is 2 days from being born here. So the fiery dragon is moving closer and closer to Jupiter as Jupiter is about to be born. But before that happens, Mercury, which moves faster than the sun, comes by and has a conjunction with Jupiter as if catching the child away. And then as the sun chases Mercury across the sky, Mercury goes into retrograde motion and comes up before Saturn to make it into God's throne. Here's Saturn, here's Saturn. Mercury is right below Saturn, so it would be right here. And 12 days between these 2 points, Mercury goes up in the sky to make part of God's throne. So the fiery dragon stood before the woman as she's ready to be delivered, and her child was caught up to God's throne. If the sun is the fiery dragon, then he also has to fulfill everything in yellow. And behold a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns upon his heads. And his tail drew the 3rd part of the stars of heaven and did cast them to the earth. Let's start with the dragon's 7 heads. If the sun is the fiery dragon, what would you consider to be a head on that dragon? When I first found this sign, it just occurred to me that if the fiery dragon is the sun, then the planets need to be the heads. But there's one problem with that, and that is that there are 8 heads. We have 8 planets around the sun, but the Earth does not count. We do not see this when we look up into the sky at the fiery dragon with his heads, because the Earth is under our feet. The Earth also does not wear a crown. Each one of these planets is a god. It's a small god. They each wear a crown. Revelation 13:1 also says that these heads have blasphemous names, which these do. These are all little gods. Anything other than God's name is blasphemous. Back to Revelation 12:3-6. And behold a great red dragon, and his tail drew the 3rd part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them to the earth. These are the Mazzaroth from Job 38:32. They are known as the zodiac today. As the earth travels around the sun, we see the sun slice up the heavens into 3 different parts. It slices it into the part that the sun travels through, and it slices it from what's above and what's below. His tail draws down 1/3 of the stars of heaven. You have the top part, which is 1/3. You have the bottom part, which is 1/3. And you have the part that the fiery dragon travels through, which is 1/3. So his tail drew 1/3 part of the stars of heaven. Now let's watch him cast them to the earth. As you can see, I moved the sun over in front of the twins, and as the earth moves across the sky with the sun in the background, it's going to look like the stars are being cast out by the sun. And then 6 months later, the earth is passing through those stars that the sun has cast out to the earth. And the sun is on the other side casting out stars that the earth will pass through in another 6 months. So that's the dragon's tail, and how his tail draws down 1/3 of the stars of heaven and casts them to the earth. Now let's go over to the last part, which is the dragon's 10 horns. Revelation 17:12. And the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings. Daniel 7:24. And the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings. This is one of the ways these two books are tied together. It's talking about the same 10 horns, which are 10 kings. In the book of Daniel, we get a lot more information about these 10 horns as well as an 11th horn. Daniel 7, 7, and 8. And it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. Daniel 7:20. And of the 10 horns that were in his head, and of the other which came up, and before whom 3 fell, even of that horn that had eyes, and a mouth that spake very great things, whose look was more stout than his fellows. And Daniel 7:24. And the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise, and another shall rise after them, and he shall be diverse from the first, and shall subdue 3 kings. Now back to the description of the dragon. The dragon has 10 horns. The 10 horns are not necessarily on the 7 heads, although some of them are, some of them are not. The reason I mention this is because that I have found 10 horns, of which 3 have fallen. The first 7 of these horns are the largest moons in our solar system, and they are the next 7 biggest things after the planets. The next 3 biggest objects after the 7 moons are the dwarf planets. And you'll notice that Pluto is one of these. If you remember, Pluto used to be a head, but now it's a horn. That's because in 2006, the International Astronomical Union got together and they demoted Pluto from being a planet to being a dwarf planet. The reason for that is because we have found other objects in our solar system that are around the same size as Pluto. Eris is just a little bit bigger than Pluto. Makemake is just a little bit smaller. We then have a bunch of other objects smaller than Makemake running down the line, and the International Astronomical Union had to decide whether to make all of these planets or to demote Pluto. That fulfills Daniel 7:7-8. There were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots, and Daniel 7:20, 3 fell. Now I do want to mention that what we are reading here in the book of Daniel is not the sign that is talked about in the book of Revelation. Yet we come here and we get a bunch of information about these 10 horns which are mentioned in the book of Revelation, and it's one of the ways these two books are tied together. So there are your 10 horns, of which 3 fell. Now I know some of you are thinking, yeah, those could be the 10 horns, and even though 3 of them fell, I'd rather believe some itching ears teaching out on the internet. Well, what if God put something kind of like an exclamation point right at the end of these 10 to let you know that these are the 10 horns out of the book of Revelation? Daniel 7:7-8. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots, and behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. Daniel 7:20. And of the 10 horns that were in his head, and of the other which came up, and before whom 3 fell, even of that horn that had eyes, and a mouth that spake very great things, whose look was more stout than his fellows. So these 3 verses are talking specifically about an 11th horn. But it does not say this 11th horn is a sign up in the heavens. And if this is a sign up in the heavens, the 11th horn has to fit with these verses. In this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth, even of that horn that had eyes, and a mouth whose look was more stout than his fellows. Now I have to ask you, why do you think these 2 verses mention twice that this guy has eyes like the eyes of a man and a mouth? Doesn't everybody have eyes and a mouth? Unless these 2 verses could possibly be talking about something else. Now, before we go any further, I do want to mention that the first 7 of these photographs are actual photographs. The last 3 of Eris, Pluto, and Makemake, and also the one I'm going to show you, are artist renditions. That's because we do not have any close-up photographs of any of these dwarf planets. Here are the dwarf planets, Eris, Pluto, Makemake, and Haumea. These are number 8, 9, 10, and 11 in size after the 7 largest moons, and before Haumea, these are the 3 that fell. Eris has 1 moon, Pluto is showing 3 here, and there's actually 5 and possibly more. Haumea is the only dwarf planet that has 2 moons, like the eyes of a man. Haumea is also the only dwarf planet or moon that is oblong-shaped. All the rest of them are round. Is he more stout than his fellows? Astronomers are also detecting a red area on Haumea. Now again, I want to remind you that this is an artist's rendition, poorly done, of a red area on Haumea. But the point is, there's a red area representing a mouth. So Haumea is the 11th horn. He's got 2 eyes like the eyes of a man. He's got a mouth. He's more stout than his fellows, and before him, Eris, Pluto, and Makemake fell. How is that possible? Now I want to remind you that God made these and put them in their places, and I believe it's to show us who the 10 horns are. So there are your 10 horns out of the book of Revelation, and your 11th horn with the 3 before him who fell out of the book of Daniel. Let's do a quick final run through of this sign. The fiery dragon, the sun, stood before the woman, ready to be delivered, and her child was caught up to God's throne. The dragon has 7 heads: Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Mars, Venus, Mercury, and Jupiter. The dragon's 7 heads wear crowns. They are all blasphemous names. The dragon's tail draws down 1/3 of the stars of heaven and casts them to the earth. And the dragon's 10 horns, which are the next 10 biggest objects in our solar system after the planets. We have the 7 largest moons, followed by the 3 largest dwarf planets. Those dwarf planets were heads, now they are horns, and this is punctuated by Haumea, the 11th horn, who has 2 eyes like the eyes of a man, a mouth, he's more stout than his fellows, and before him, Eris, Pluto, and Makemake fell in 2006. The sign up in the heavens are in the blue, and the description of the dragon is in the red. Now this part, which is in blue and red, is because I believe this is what marks 2 Thessalonians 2:4 when Satan sits in the throne room of God in the new temple proclaiming himself to be God. But that's just a guess. This completely fulfills Revelation chapter 12 verses 3 through 5's another sign in heaven.